Tollund Man. In 1950, two brothers cutting peat in Denmark's Bjergskovdal bog made a discovery that would haunt them forever. A face emerged from the earth, so perfectly preserved that they believed they had stumbled upon a recent murder victim. The skin was leathered but intact, the expression peaceful, almost serene. But this was no modern corpse, this was Tollund Man, and he had been dead for over 2,400 years. The body told a story of ritual sacrifice. Around his neck, a braided leather rope was pulled tight, the noose still in place exactly as it had been when he drew his last breath. The rope, made from two leather thongs twisted together, had been carefully crafted for one purpose: to kill. Forensic examination revealed the method of death with chilling clarity. He was hanged, but not in the way we think of execution today. The rope compressed his throat, cutting off blood flow to the brain while leaving the windpipe partially open. Death would have come slowly, consciousness fading as his brain was starved of oxygen. It would have taken several minutes, each second an eternity. His last meal was still in his stomach. Researchers found a porridge made from barley, flax, and dozens of different seeds, many of them weeds. No meat, no luxury. This was the meal of someone prepared for death, possibly a willing sacrifice to the gods. The Germanic peoples of the Iron Age believed that hanging was the death of Odin, the highest god. To die by the rope was to join the Allfather in Valhalla. But there's another interpretation, darker still. The peaceful expression on his face, the careful preparation of his body, suggests he may have been drugged. Some victims of bog sacrifice show signs of having consumed hallucinogenic substances before death. Did Tollund Man go to his death in a dreamlike state, unaware of the noose tightening around his neck? The bog did something remarkable to his body. The acidic, oxygen-free environment prevented decomposition while tanning his skin like leather. His internal organs dissolved, but his skin, hair, and even his fingerprints remained intact. When archaeologists opened him up, they found his throat crushed, the hyoid bone fractured from the pressure of the rope. The expression on his face, so peaceful in death, masked the violence of his final moments. Phalaris' bull. In the 6th century BCE, the tyrant Phalaris ruled the Greek city of Acragas in Sicily with unprecedented cruelty. But his most infamous legacy wasn't a military conquest or political achievement. It was a machine designed purely for torture, a brazen bull that would become synonymous with ancient horror. The bull was the creation of Perilos of Athens, a brass smith who approached Phalaris with what he believed was an innovative gift. The hollow bronze statue was large enough to contain a full-grown man. It was beautiful on the outside, crafted with artistic skill, but inside it was an oven of death. Perilos explained his design with pride. A door on the side would open, allowing victims to be placed inside. A fire would be lit beneath the bull's belly, slowly heating the bronze until it glowed red. As the victim roasted alive, their screams would travel through a system of tubes and chambers designed to make the sounds emerge from the bull's mouth as bellowing, almost musical notes. Phalaris listened to this presentation with interest. Then he made a decision that would echo through history. "Let's test it," he said. And he ordered Perilos himself to be the first victim. The brass smith was forced into his own creation. As the door sealed shut and the fires were lit, Perilos understood the full horror of what he had made. Ancient sources describe what happened next in visceral detail. The bronze heated slowly at first, then faster as the fire intensified. Inside, Perilos felt the temperature rise. His skin began to burn, adhering to the hot metal. He screamed, and those screams emerged from the bull's mouth as a grotesque melody. The bronze conducted heat with terrifying efficiency, becoming an oven that cooked him from all sides simultaneously. Historical accounts disagree on exactly when Phalaris ordered him removed. Some say he was pulled out before death, only to be hurled from a hilltop to finish what the bull had started. Others claim he roasted completely, his fat dripping through holes in the bottom, his flesh liquefying in the intense heat. The smell would have been overwhelming, the sound of his screams mixed with the roaring of flames, creating a symphony of agony. Phalaris would go on to use the bull for years, burning his enemies alive in the bronze beast. When he was finally overthrown, the people of Akragas found poetic justice. They locked Phalaris inside his own bull and lit the fire, forcing him to experience firsthand the torture device he had used so freely on others. The bull itself survived for centuries, becoming a legendary artifact of cruelty. The Little Princes. In 1483, 2 boys disappeared from the Tower of London. Edward V, the 12-year-old King of England, and his 9-year-old brother Richard, Duke of York, were last seen playing in the Tower's gardens that summer. They were never seen alive again. What happened in those stone walls remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. But in 1674, workmen made a discovery that suggested the answer was far darker than anyone wanted to believe. During renovations, workers demolishing a staircase found a wooden chest buried 10 feet below ground. Inside were 2 small skeletons, their bones intertwined as if they had died holding each other. The skulls showed they were children, roughly matching the ages of the missing princes. King Charles II ordered them reburied in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today, but the bones themselves told a story of murder. Contemporary accounts describe how the boys were moved to increasingly secure parts of the tower, their windows barred, their movements restricted. Servants who attended them reported seeing them less and less frequently. Then nothing. The most widely accepted theory, based on historical analysis and the testimony of those who served in the tower, paints a picture of premeditated murder. Sir James Tyrrell, a loyal servant to Richard III, reportedly confessed years later to organising the killing. According to his account, he sent 2 men, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, to the boys' chambers in the dead of night. The princes were asleep in their bed, innocent and unaware. The assassins pressed pillows over their faces, holding them down as the children struggled. The fight would have been brief. Edward, though 12, was described as sickly and weak. Richard was just 9. They kicked and thrashed as their air was cut off, their small bodies fighting against the weight of grown men. When the movement stopped, the assassins held the pillows in place longer, ensuring no spark of life remained. Then came the disposal. The bodies were buried at the foot of the stairs, covered with stones and earth, hidden where they would remain undiscovered for nearly 200 years. The 1933 examination of the bones by experts at the British Medical Association revealed details that support this narrative. Both skeletons showed signs of suffocation. One skull had a stain consistent with smothering. The ages matched, the location matched. Everything pointed to murder, to 2 children killed in their sleep by men following orders from above. What makes this death so gruesome isn't the method, it's the betrayal. These were royal children, promised protection, locked in what should have been a fortress of safety. Instead, the tower became their tomb, and their uncle, possibly their murderer. Hypatia of Alexandria. In March of 415 CE, the brilliant mathematician and philosopher Hypatia left her home in Alexandria, unaware that a mob was waiting for her. She was one of the most prominent intellectuals of her time, teaching Neoplatonism and mathematics to students from across the Roman Empire. But in a city increasingly dominated by Christian zealots, her learning, her gender, and her pagan beliefs made her a target. The mob that attacked her was led by a reader named Peter, acting under the influence of Cyril, the Archbishop of Alexandria. They pulled her from her chariot in broad daylight, dragging her through the streets to the Caesareum, a former pagan temple converted into a Christian church. What happened next was recorded by multiple ancient historians, each account more horrifying than the last. The mob stripped her naked, a deliberation designed to humiliate. Then they began their work. According to the historian Socrates Scholasticus, they used ostraca, which could mean either roof tiles or oyster shells. Imagine sharp-edged pottery fragments or shells with serrated edges, used as improvised tools of torture. They scraped her skin, flaying her alive piece by piece. The ostraca tore through flesh, exposing muscle and bone. She was conscious through it all, her screams echoing through the Caesareum, while Christian zealots cheered. The details preserved by John of Nikiu, a Coptic bishop writing 2 centuries later, add another layer of horror. He claimed her body was dismembered while she still lived, her limbs torn from her torso. Whether this happened before or after she died from blood loss and shock remains unclear, but the violence was extreme, systematic, and prolonged. This wasn't a quick murder. This was ritual destruction, the erasure of everything she represented. After she was dead, or possibly while she clung to life, they burned her remains. The library of Alexandria's last great scholar, a woman whose work in mathematics and astronomy would be lost for centuries, was reduced to ash and scattered. The murder wasn't just physical violence, it was intellectual annihilation, the destruction of knowledge and learning in the name of religious fervour. No one was ever prosecuted. Cyril, who many historians believe orchestrated the murder, was later made a saint. Hypatia's death marked a turning point in Alexandria's history, the end of its classical intellectual tradition, and the beginning of an age where questioning and learning became dangerous, Hamelin's children. In 1284, in the German town of Hamelin, 130 children followed a strange man in colourful clothes and vanished forever. The story is known worldwide as the Pied Piper, but the sanitised fairy tale conceals something far darker. Multiple medieval chronicles document that the disappearance was real, and the theories about what happened to those children range from tragic to nightmarish. The oldest accounts don't mention rats. They simply state that on June 26, 1284, a piper led the children away, and they were never seen again. The town's earliest written records, including a stained glass window in Hamelin's church created around 1300, commemorated the loss, 130 children, gone in a single day. But what really happened? One theory suggests the children were victims of a landslide or sinkhole. The piper might have led them to a limestone cave system near Hamelin, promising adventure or treasure. Inside, the unstable tunnels collapsed, burying all of them alive under tons of rock and earth. The suffocation would have been gradual and terrifying. Children trapped in absolute darkness, their air supply slowly depleting, would have clawed at the rocks until their fingers bled. Some might have survived for hours, calling out for parents who would never find them. The cave became their tomb, sealed forever, their bodies never recovered. Another theory is more sinister. In the 13th century, children were sometimes sold into labour or military service. The piper might have been a recruiter, promising adventure and wages, leading the children east to colonise newly conquered territories in Eastern Europe or Transylvania. Medieval documents from that period mention German settlements established by young colonists. These children might have marched for weeks, many dying of exhaustion, disease, or starvation along the way. Those who survived faced lives of brutal labour, building settlements in hostile territories, never to see their families again. The darkest theory involves the Children's Crusade, a movement that swept through Europe decades before Hamelin's tragedy. Young people, convinced they could succeed where armies failed, marched to reclaim the Holy Land. Most were sold into slavery or died of exposure and disease. Could Hamelin's children have been swept up in a similar movement, convinced by a charismatic speaker to embark on a doom pilgrimage? The truth remains unknown, but the grief was real. Hamelin's town records show that June 26th became a day of mourning, forbidden for celebrations or music. For centuries, the street where the children were last seen was called Bungerlosenstrasse, the street without drums, where music was banned out of respect for the lost. Whatever happened to those 130 children, it was catastrophic enough to scar an entire town for generations. The Brazen Bull's first victim. Before Piraeus met his fate, before Phalaris used the bull on countless others, there was a moment of testing. Historical accounts preserved by Diodorus Siculus and other ancient writers describe what the bull's interior was like, and the physics of the torture reveal why it was considered the ultimate execution device. Bronze conducts heat with exceptional efficiency. When the fire beneath the bull was lit, the metal would heat evenly, transforming the interior into an oven. The victim inside would feel the temperature rise gradually. At first, uncomfortable warmth, then unbearable heat, then burning. The bronze reached temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Human skin begins to burn at 118 degrees. At 400 degrees, flesh cooks like meat in an oven. The victim's feet would have burned first, the soles pressing against the hot metal, then the hands, pressed against the walls in a futile attempt to push away. The buttocks and back would adhere to the bronze, skin sticking to metal like food to a hot pan. As the heat intensified, blisters formed and burst. Fat beneath the skin began to liquefy, rendering out like cooking meat. The smell would have been overwhelmingly of burning flesh and hair, but the true horror was the duration. Unlike burning at the stake, which kills relatively quickly through smoke inhalation, the brazen bull was designed to prolong suffering. The victim had access to air through small holes drilled for the sound tubes. They could breathe, which meant they remained conscious far longer than they would have in smoke. The roasting could last 30 minutes or more, the victim's screams gradually weakening as shock and pain overwhelmed their system. The bronze itself amplified suffering. It conducted heat so efficiently that there was no reprieve, no cooler area to press against. Every surface was equally hot, cooking the victim from all sides simultaneously. When death finally came, it was from a combination of shock, hypothermia, and organ failure. The heart, struggling to pump blood through a body being cooked alive, would eventually give out. When the bull was finally opened, witnesses described bodies that had been literally roasted. The skin was blackened and cracked. The flesh had shrunk from the heat pulling away from bones. The face was often unrecognizable, the features melted and distorted. Fat had liquefied and dripped through holes in the bottom, leaving a pool of rendered human grease beneath the bull. Ötzi, the Iceman. In 1991, German hikers Helmut and Erika Simon spotted something brown protruding from the melting ice of the Ötztal Alps. They assumed it was a recent mountaineering casualty. It wasn't. This was Ötzi, a man who had died 5,300 years ago, and the circumstances of his death revealed a murder more violent than anyone initially suspected. The ice had preserved him remarkably. His body, clothing, and equipment remained intact, offering an unprecedented window into Copper Age life. But when researchers conducted a CT scan in 2001, they discovered something shocking: an arrowhead embedded in his left shoulder. Ötzi had been murdered. The evidence reconstructed his final hours with forensic precision. Ötzi had recently been in a fight. His right hand bore a deep defensive wound, suggesting he had grabbed at a blade that was trying to kill him days earlier. He'd bandaged it and fled into the mountains, but his attacker or attackers pursued him. He climbed to over 10,000 feet seeking refuge in the high passes. His killer caught up with him on a rocky outcrop. The arrow struck from a distance of approximately 30 yards, travelling upward at an angle that suggested the attacker was positioned downhill. The flint arrowhead, just under an inch long, punched through Ötzi's left shoulder blade and severed the subclavian artery, a major blood vessel that supplies the arm and parts of the chest. The wound was catastrophic. Ötzi would have felt the impact, a burning sensation as the arrow tore through muscle and bone. Then the bleeding began. The subclavian artery, when severed, spurts blood with each heartbeat. He would have bled out in minutes, possibly less. But the positioning of his body suggests he survived long enough to make a conscious decision. He set down his equipment carefully, his copper axe placed beside him, his bow unstrung. Then he lay down in a small rocky depression, perhaps seeking shelter, perhaps simply giving up. The cold was setting in. Even if the bleeding hadn't killed him immediately, hypothermia would have finished the job. His body temperature dropped as blood pooled around him. Consciousness faded. The last thing he might have seen was the sky above the Alps, the same view hikers would have 5,300 years later. His killer, for reasons we'll never know, left the valuable copper axe behind, but retrieved the arrow shaft, possibly to hide evidence of the murder. The ice came and covered him, preserving him so completely that when researchers examined his body, they found his last meal still in his stomach. Ibex meat and einkorn wheat. Consumed hours before his death, they found tattoos on his skin, carbon ink poked into flesh to mark acupuncture points, suggesting he suffered from chronic pain. They found intestinal parasites, signs of dental problems, and evidence of hardened arteries. But most importantly, they found proof that even 5,300 years ago, humans were capable of murder, pursuit, and violence. Ötzi died alone in the mountains, bleeding out from an arrow wound, killed by someone who took the time to hunt him down and finish what an earlier fight had started. His body, frozen for millennia, became a time capsule of Bronze Age violence, crushing by elephant. For over 4,000 years, from ancient India to 19th century Southeast Asia, execution by elephant was considered one of the most terrifying ways to die. Unlike other execution methods that aimed for quick death, elephant crushing was designed as a spectacle, a public demonstration of power that could be prolonged for maximum suffering or concluded with brutal efficiency. Elephants were trained specifically for this purpose from a young age. They learned commands that determined the victim's fate. A skilled mahout, the elephant's handler, could make the execution last as long as desired, drawing out the torment for hours or ending it in seconds. The condemned person was typically bound and placed on the ground before the elephant, unable to escape, forced to watch the massive creature approach. The most common method involved the elephant using its feet. An adult elephant weighs between 8,000 and 13,000 pounds. When that weight is concentrated on a single foot placed on a human body, the results are catastrophic. The elephant would be commanded to step on the victim's chest. The ribcage collapsed instantly, bones splintering inward, puncturing lungs and heart. Death came from a combination of crushed organs and suffocation, as broken ribs made breathing impossible. But this quick death was a mercy rarely granted. More often, the elephant was commanded to crush limbs individually. It would place its foot on an arm, pressing down slowly. Witnesses described hearing bones crack like dry wood, the sound audible even in large crowds. The victim's screams intensified as each bone broke, the pressure continuing until the limb was flattened, muscles and tendons torn apart, blood vessels ruptured. Then the elephant moved to the next limb. An execution could involve crushing each arm and leg individually before finally moving to the torso. Some accounts describe even more sadistic variations. The elephant could be trained to use its trunk to break bones one at a time, or to slowly crush the skull, applying gradually increasing pressure until the cranium finally cracked. In other cases, the elephant would be commanded to strike the victim with its tusks, impaling them and then lifting them into the air, letting them slide down the tusk as gravity pulled their body weight onto the sharp ivory. Historical records from the Mughal Empire describe Emperor Akbar witnessing elephant executions where the condemned were placed in a shallow pit, preventing them from rolling away as the elephant systematically crushed them. The execution could be paused at any point, allowing the victim to suffer while the crowd watched. Medical shock would eventually set in, but not before the victim experienced unimaginable pain. The psychological torture was as significant as the physical. Victims would be brought before the elephant hours before the execution, forced to contemplate their approaching death while watching the massive animal that would kill them. Some accounts describe victims begging for mercy, only to have the elephant's foot placed on their body in a mock execution before being removed, only to have the process repeated, drawing out the terror. The practice continued well into the 19th century. British colonial records from India document elephant executions witnessed by European officers, their descriptions both horrified and fascinated by the spectacle. The last recorded elephant execution is believed to have occurred in Sri Lanka in the late 1800s, though some historians suggest the practice continued in remote regions well into the 20th century. Lindow Man. In 1984, peat cutters working in Lindow Moss, a bog in Cheshire, England, discovered human remains. Unlike Tollund Man, whose preserved face suggested a peaceful end, Lindow Man told a different story. He had died violently, and the archaeological evidence suggested something far more sinister than simple murder. This was ritual sacrifice, and it involved what scholars call the threefold death. Lindow Man was approximately 25 years old when he died, sometime between Tollund BCE and 119 CE. His body was remarkably preserved, allowing researchers to reconstruct his final moments with disturbing clarity. The violence began with a blow to the head. Someone struck him with a blunt object, possibly an axe blade used flat, fracturing his skull in 2 places. The blows would have stunned him, dropping him to his knees, but they weren't fatal. He was still alive when the second phase began. A cord made of sinew was looped around his neck, forming a garrote. The killer pulled tight, strangling him while simultaneously breaking his neck. The vertebrae in his cervical spine showed fracture damage consistent with both strangulation and violent twisting. His neck was broken, the spinal cord severed, causing immediate paralysis below the neck, but the garrote continued to compress his throat, cutting off blood flow to his brain and air to his lungs. He was dying, but slowly. Then came the third death. While he was either dying or freshly dead, someone cut his throat. The wound was precise, slicing through the jugular vein and windpipe. Blood would have poured from the wound, though whether his heart was still beating to pump it out remains debated. The combination of skull fractures, strangulation, broken neck, and throat cutting is what scholars call overkill, but in the context of Iron Age religious practices, it likely represented something else, a sacrifice to multiple gods simultaneously. Analysis of his stomach contents revealed his last meal, a griddle cake made from barley and wheat burned on the outside. Some researchers believe the burning was intentional, a ritual food consumed before sacrifice. His fingernails were carefully manicured, suggesting he was of high status or specially prepared for death. He had a full beard and mustache, and his body showed no signs of manual labour. This wasn't the sacrifice of a slave or prisoner. This was someone important, possibly a willing volunteer or a nobleman selected for the honour of ritual death. The bog preserved him so completely that when archaeologists examined him, they could see his expression. Unlike Tollund Man's peaceful face, Lindow Man's features showed distortion, possibly from the violence of his death or from the way his body settled in the bog. His eyes were closed, but his mouth was slightly open. One researcher described it as looking like he was trying to speak one last time before the darkness took him. The most haunting detail came from pollen analysis. His gut contents showed he died in March or April, during a time when ancient Celts held spring festivals. Some historians believe he was a druidic sacrifice, offered to ensure good harvests. Others suggest he might have been a tribal leader killed as part of succession rituals. What's certain is that his death was planned, ritualized, and carried out with methodical precision. He was killed 3 times over, ensuring that no matter which gods were watching, the sacrifice would be accepted. The death of Gilles de Rais. On October 26, 1440, a French nobleman was executed for crimes so horrific that his trial records were sealed for centuries. Gilles de Rais, once a Marshal of France and companion at arms to Joan of Arc, confessed to the murder and sexual assault of between 80 and 200 children. The details of his crimes, preserved in trial documents, describe systematic torture and murder that lasted nearly a decade. De Rais's methodology was consistent and calculated. He targeted children from poor families, often peasants who lived on or near his estates. His servants would lure them with promises of food, work, or education. Once in his castle, the children would disappear. What happened inside those stone walls was described in graphic detail during his trial, testimony so disturbing that the judge repeatedly tried to stop witnesses from continuing. The children were taken to de Rais's private chambers. He would assault them first, then begin the torture. Methods included dismemberment while the victims were still alive, cutting into their bodies to watch them bleed. He reportedly derived sexual pleasure from their suffering, sometimes achieving orgasm on their mutilated bodies as they died. He would cut their throats, sometimes decapitating them, other times simply letting them bleed out while he watched. Some were hanged, others stabbed repeatedly. The youngest victims were as young as 6 years old. After the murders, Rais faced the problem of disposal. Bodies were burned in large fireplaces in his chambers. The smell of burning flesh masked by incense and herbs. Bones that didn't fully burn were thrown into the castle's cesspits or buried in secret locations throughout his properties. When investigators finally searched his estates after his arrest, they found bone fragments, bloodstains, and ash containing human remains. His trial was a sensation. Rais initially refused to acknowledge the court's authority, but when threatened with excommunication and torture, he confessed everything. His testimony was detailed and unrepentant. He described his crimes methodically, explaining his methods and motivations with a clarity that horrified everyone present. He claimed that he had been inspired by the Roman Emperor Caligula and Tiberius, whose cruelties he had read about in Latin texts. He expressed regret, but only for the offence to God, not for the children's suffering. His execution was designed to reflect both his noble status and his heinous crimes. He was to be hanged, then burned. On the day of execution, October 26, 1440, he was led to the gallows. Unlike common criminals, who were hanged until dead, Rais was strangled with a rope, but cut down before death. While still conscious, he was placed on a pile of wood and set on fire. Noble prisoners were typically shown the mercy of having their bodies burned after death, but Rais's crimes warranted him experiencing the flames alive. The burning was brief. Friends and family had petitioned for mercy, and the executioners agreed to remove his body from the flames before it was consumed entirely. His charred corpse was taken to a Carmelite monastery and buried in consecrated ground, a privilege granted, despite his crimes, because he had confessed and shown repentance. The monastery's location was kept secret to prevent the grave from being desecrated. Modern historians debate aspects of Rais's trial. Some suggest confessions were coerced or exaggerated to allow political rivals to seize his wealth and estates, but the physical evidence, including bones found on his properties and testimony from multiple servants who witnessed the crimes, supports the conviction. Whether he killed 80 children or 200, the scope of his crimes marks him as one of history's most prolific serial killers, and his death, though brutal, was arguably merciful compared to what his victims endured. Defenestration of Prague. On May 23, 1618, Protestant nobles in Prague made a decision that would trigger one of the deadliest conflicts in European history. They seized 2 Catholic imperial governors and their secretary, marched them to a window in Prague Castle's Bohemian chancellery, and threw them out. The fall was approximately 70 feet. The 3 men, Vilém Slavata, Jaroslav Božita of Martinice, and their secretary Philip Fabricius, were given no trial, no chance to defend themselves. The Protestant nobles had decided their fate. One by one, they were lifted and pushed through the window. The fall itself would have lasted about 2 seconds, enough time for each man to understand what was happening but not enough to prepare. Human bodies falling 70 feet reach speeds of approximately 45 miles per hour. When they hit the ground, the impact generates forces exceeding 100 Gs, more than enough to shatter bones and rupture organs, but all 3 men survived. Catholic sources claimed it was a miracle, divine intervention saving the governors from certain death. Protestant sources had a more mundane explanation. They landed in a pile of horse manure and refuse that had accumulated at the base of the castle wall. The truth likely involves both factors. The refuse heap, several feet deep, provided some cushioning, but the impact would still have been devastating. All 3 men suffered severe injuries, broken bones, internal bleeding, and tremor that left them unconscious for hours. Slavata took months to recover, his body broken in multiple places. Modern medical analysis suggests he likely suffered fractures to his legs, pelvis, and ribs, along with internal injuries that could easily have killed him through internal bleeding or infection in an era before modern medicine. The secretary, Fabricius, who was in his 60s, suffered the worst injuries. He never fully recovered, dying months later from complications likely stemming from the fall. His death was slow and painful, possibly from internal bleeding that physicians of the era couldn't detect or treat. He would have experienced increasing pain as damaged organs failed, blood pooling in his abdominal cavity, slowly poisoning his system. The defenestration sparked the 30 Years' War, a conflict that killed approximately 8 million people through combat, starvation, and disease. The three men who were thrown from the window became symbols of religious conflict, their survival or suffering depending on which side told the story, but their bodies, broken by a 70-foot fall onto stone and filth, represented the brutality that would define the coming decades. Scaphism. Ancient Persia developed one of the most prolonged and horrific execution methods ever devised. The Greeks called it scaphism, from the word for hollowed out, and it involved trapping the victim between two boats or hollowed logs, covering them in honey and leaving them to die. The process took days, sometimes weeks, and death came from a combination of dehydration, sepsis, and being consumed alive by insects. The condemned person was stripped and force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. Then they were placed in a small boat or hollowed log with only their head, hands, and feet exposed. A second boat or log was placed on top, creating a sealed cavity with openings for the extremities. More honey was poured on the exposed skin, particularly on the face and genitals. Then the victim was set afloat on a stagnant pond, or placed in a location where the sun would beat down on them directly. The honey attracted insects immediately. Flies, wasps, and bees swarmed the victim's exposed flesh, stinging and biting. But the real horror began hours later when the diarrhea started. The victim was unable to control their bowels, and excrement accumulated inside the boat, mixing with the honey and creating a breeding ground for bacteria. The combination of feces, urine, and honey fermented in the heat, and within a day, maggots appeared. Flies laid their eggs in the wounds from insect bites and in the victim's orifices. The maggots hatched and began to eat, burrowing into living flesh. They would infest the ears, nose, mouth, eyes, and genitals, consuming the victim from the inside out. The Greek historian Plutarch recorded the death of Mithridates, a soldier who was executed via scaphism. His torture lasted 17 days, during which he was force-fed daily to keep him alive as long as possible. By the end, witnesses reported that his body was so covered in maggots that it appeared to be moving, a writhing mass of larvae consuming him while his heart still beat. The psychological torture was as extreme as the physical. The victim was fully conscious and aware of what was happening. They could feel the insects burrowing into their flesh, the maggots eating them alive. Dehydration set in after the first day, causing excruciating pain. The tongue swelled, making swallowing impossible. The throat felt like sandpaper, every breath a struggle. Hallucinations began as dehydration affected the brain. Sepsis developed as bacteria from the excrement entered the bloodstream through wounds and the digestive tract. Fever spiked, alternating with chills. The victim's immune system went into overdrive, then collapsed. Organ failure began, kidneys shutting down first, followed by the liver. The brain, deprived of the proper blood flow and poisoned by toxins, began to shut down. Some victims reportedly went mad before death, screaming incoherently at hallucinations only they could see. Death finally came from a combination of septic shock, dehydration, and organ failure. By that time, much of the victim's flesh had been consumed by maggots, their body a hollow shell infested with larvae. The entire process was visible to anyone passing by, serving as both punishment and warning. The brazen bull of Phalaris, extended torture. While we've discussed Perillos's death, the brazen bull's use extended far beyond its inventor. Historical sources describe executions that lasted hours, with victims slowly roasted, while guards maintained precise fire temperatures to prolong suffering. Let's examine what the experience was actually like, based on forensic understanding of heat torture. At 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the victim feels intense discomfort. Sweating begins as the body attempts to cool itself. At 130 degrees, the skin reddens, capillaries dilating in a futile attempt to dissipate heat. At 140 degrees, first-degree burns begin. The outer layer of skin begins to die. The victim is in severe pain, but still fully conscious. At 150 160 degrees, second-degree burns develop rapidly. Blisters form as fluid accumulates between skin layers. The pain becomes excruciating, but the victim remains conscious because the bronze maintains air holes that prevent smoke inhalation. At 170 180 degrees, third-degree burns begin. The skin chars, turning black. Nerve endings die, which paradoxically reduces pain in some areas, while increasing it in others where nerves remain functional. At 200 degrees and above, the body begins to cook like meat. Fat liquefies and drips through holes in the bottom of the bull. Muscle tissue contracts, causing the body to curl into a fetal position. The smell intensifies, the odour of cooking human flesh mixing with burning hair and boiling bodily fluids. The victim's screams, which have echoed through the bull's acoustic chambers as musical notes, begin to weaken as the larynx is damaged by heat and dehydration. The victim's eyes would have boiled in their sockets. The corneas, composed primarily of water, would evaporate, leaving behind dried husks. The tongue would swell, then char, making coherent speech impossible. Internal organs would begin to cook, starting with those closest to the body surface. The lungs, breathing superheated air, would be seared from the inside. Each breath would damage more tissue, gradually reducing the lungs' ability to function. The heart would continue beating throughout this ordeal, sometimes for 30 minutes or more. The cardiovascular system, struggling to circulate blood through a body that's being cooked, would gradually fail. Blood pressure would spike, then crash as blood vessels were damaged by heat. The brain, still receiving some oxygen-rich blood, would keep the victim conscious far longer than seems possible, trapping them inside their body as it transformed from living flesh to cooked meat. Death finally came from cardiac arrest, the heart muscle itself damaged by heat and unable to continue pumping. But even then, if the fire was maintained, the body would continue cooking. By the time the bull was open, bodies were often unrecognizable, shrunken and charred, barely identifiable as human. Historical accounts mention that Phalaris developed a refinement to the torture. He would have musicians play outside the bull during executions, their music, competing with the victim's screams, creating a grotesque symphony. The bull would be placed in a public square, allowing crowds to gather and watch. The bronze would glow red hot, visibly radiating heat, while inside, invisible to the crowd, a human being was roasted alive. The practice of execution by burning in enclosed spaces continued in various forms throughout history, but the brazen bull remained unique in its design. It wasn't just execution, it was performance art, a machine designed to transform human suffering into entertainment. The bull survived its creator, Phalaris, by centuries, eventually being taken to Carthage, where it was possibly used during the Punic Wars. Its final fate remains unknown, but its legacy as one of history's most sadistic execution devices is secure: the death of William Wallace. On August 23, 1305, Scottish knight William Wallace was executed in London for high treason. The English crown, led by King Edward III, designed his execution to be as public and brutal as possible, sending a message to anyone who might consider rebellion. The sentence was hanged, drawn, and quartered, but the reality was far more grotesque than those words suggest. Wallace was dragged through the streets of London tied to a horse, his body scraping along rough cobblestones for miles. By the time he reached Smithfield, his skin was torn and bleeding, his body covered in dirt and excrement thrown by jeering crowds. But this was merely the beginning. He was stripped naked and hanged, but the executioner was careful not to let him die. The noose was placed to choke him without breaking his neck, and he was lifted just high enough that his toes touched the ground. He struggled, half strangled, for several minutes before being cut down while still alive. Contemporary accounts describe him as conscious and aware as the next phase began. While Wallace was still breathing, the executioner made an incision in his abdomen. The cut ran from the base of the rib cage to the pelvis, opening the abdominal cavity. his intestines were pulled out, slowly while he watched. This process, called disemboweling, was agonizingly slow. The intestines, still connected to the body, were drawn out foot by foot and burned in a fire prepared specifically for this purpose. The smell of his own burning organs filled Wallace's nostrils as he felt his body being emptied. The executioner then reached higher, cutting through the diaphragm to access the chest cavity. Wallace's lungs were still functioning, pulling in air, keeping him conscious. His heart was still beating, pumping blood through a body that was being systematically destroyed. The executioner removed his genitals, displaying them to the crowd before throwing them into the fire. The pain would have been beyond description, but Wallace reportedly made no sound, refusing to give his executioners the satisfaction of hearing him scream. Finally, mercifully, the executioner cut out his heart. This was the moment of death. Without a heart to pump blood, Wallace's brain was starved of oxygen, and consciousness ceased within seconds. But even in death, the mutilation continued. His body was beheaded, the head placed on a pike to be displayed on London Bridge. His body was cut into 4 quarters, each piece sent to a different region of Scotland and hung in public places: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth. The message was clear. This is what happens to traitors. Modern medical experts who have analysed accounts of Wallace's execution estimate he remained conscious for approximately 15 and 20 minutes after the disemboweling began. His death wasn't quick or clean. It was designed to be the worst possible experience a human body could endure while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. Rasputin's death. On December 30th, 1916, a group of Russian nobles decided to kill Grigory Rasputin, the mystic who held enormous influence over Tsar Nicholas II and his wife. They invited him to Prince Felix Yusupov's palace under the pretense of meeting Yusupov's wife. What followed was a death so difficult to achieve that it became legendary, though modern analysis suggests some details were exaggerated. The assassins prepared cakes and wine laced with massive doses of cyanide. When Rasputin arrived, he consumed them, and nothing happened. The conspirators watched in growing panic as he ate cakes containing enough poison to kill 5 men, washing them down with poison wine, and remained standing. Modern analysis suggests either the poison was defective or the presence of sugar in the cakes and alcohol in the wine neutralized the cyanide's effectiveness. After waiting 2 hours, Yusupov panicked and shot Rasputin in the chest. The bullet entered near the heart, a wound that should have been immediately fatal. Rasputin collapsed, and the conspirators left the room to discuss disposal of the body. But when they returned, Rasputin was gone. They found him crawling across the courtyard towards the gate, still trying to escape despite a bullet in his chest. One of the conspirators, Vladimir Purishkevich, shot him again, this time in the back, then again. A third bullet struck Rasputin in the head. He finally stopped moving. The conspirators beat his body with clubs, ensuring he was dead. But when they checked his pulse, they claimed it was still beating weakly. In a panic, they wrapped his body in a cloth, drove to the Malaya Nevka River, and threw him through a hole in the ice. The freezing water of the river would have been shock enough to kill anyone who still clung to life, but autopsy reports, though disputed, suggested water was found in his lungs. If accurate, this meant Rasputin was still alive when he hit the water and drew breath underwater as he drowned. The truth is likely less dramatic. Modern forensic analysis suggests Rasputin died from the gunshot wounds, possibly the one to the head, and was likely dead before being thrown in the river. The Eosh legend of his invincibility was partially created by the assassins themselves, who wanted to justify their elaborate and brutal methods by painting Rasputin as something almost supernatural. When his body was recovered from the river 3 days later, it was frozen solid. The autopsy, conducted under rushed conditions with political pressure to quickly dispose of the body, was incomplete, and its records are contradictory. What's certain is that he suffered multiple gunshot wounds, severe blunt force trauma, and was submerged in freezing water. Whether he died from poison, bullets, beating, or drowning may never be conclusively known, but his death involved at least 3 of those 4 methods. The fate of Valeria Messalina. In 48 CE, Valeria Messalina, third wife of the Roman Emperor Claudius, made a fatal mistake. While her husband was away from Rome, she married her lover Gaius Silius in a public ceremony. This wasn't just adultery, it was treason, an attempt to overthrow the emperor. When Claudius learned of the marriage, he ordered her execution, but the story of her death reveals the precarious position of even the most powerful Roman women. Messalina was known for her sexual appetites, behavior that scandalized even Romans accustomed to libertine behavior among the elite. Ancient sources, particularly Tacitus and Juvenal, describe her sneaking out of the palace at night to work in brothels, competing with prostitutes to see how many clients she could service. While these accounts are likely exaggerated by historians who despised her, they established her reputation. When news of her mock marriage to Silius reached Claudius, he was initially paralyzed with shock. His advisors, particularly the freedman Narcissus, took control. Silius was executed immediately, along with most of the wedding guests. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus, an estate she owned, taking refuge with her mother. Claudius, described by ancient sources as wavering between anger and lingering affection, seemed unable to give a clear order for execution. Narcissus, fearing the emperor would pardon her if she appeared before him, took matters into his own hands. He sent a tribune and a centurion to the gardens with orders to execute Messalina immediately. When the soldiers arrived, Messalina was with her mother, Domitia Lepida. Ancient accounts describe a scene of chaos and terror. Messalina begged for time to compose herself, asking for a chance to die with dignity. She was given a dagger and ordered to kill herself. She pressed the blade against her throat, then her chest, but couldn't complete the act. Her hands shook. She made shallow cuts, not deep enough to be fatal, while her mother watched helplessly. The soldiers grew impatient. The centurion stepped forward and drove his sword into her chest. The blade punched through her ribcage, piercing her heart. She died instantly, collapsing onto the floor of the garden. Her body was left there for Claudius to see if he wished, but he reportedly showed no interest. He ordered her name erased from public monuments and records, a damnatio memoriae that attempted to delete her from history. The brutality of her death lay not in its method, which was relatively quick, but in its sudden shift from supreme power to violent end. One day she was empress, wife of the most powerful man in the world. Hours later, she was cornered in a garden, forced to attempt suicide, then run through when she couldn't complete the task. Her body, which had been adorned in imperial purple and gold, died in simple clothes, her blood soaking into the garden soil. Edmund Ironside's death. King Edmund II of England, known as Edmund Ironside, died on November 30th, 1016, in circumstances so bizarre and gruesome that historians still debate whether the accounts are real or medieval fabrications. According to multiple medieval chronicles, including the writings of Henry of Huntingdon, Edmund was assassinated in the most intimate and vulnerable moment possible, while using the toilet. The story goes that Edmund was at Oxford when he needed to relieve himself. He went to the privy, a simple outdoor toilet consisting of a wooden seat over a pit. Medieval toilets were dark, private places, perfect for assassination. A killer had hidden in the cesspit below, submerged in excrement, waiting for the king. As Edmund sat down, the assassin reached up with a dagger or sword and stabbed him twice from below. The blade entered through Edmund's anus, driving upward into his bowels. The king screamed and tried to stand, but the assassin struck again. The wounds were catastrophic. The blade had punctured his intestines and possibly his bladder, spilling their contents into his abdominal cavity. Edmund managed to stagger from the privy, clutching his wounds, but the damage was fatal. In an era before antibiotics or modern surgery, a punctured bowel meant inevitable death from sepsis. The contents of the intestines, filled with bacteria, would flood the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis. The infection would spread rapidly, causing fever, intense abdominal pain, and organ failure. The chronicles describe Edmund suffering for hours before finally dying. The pain would have been excruciating. Peritonitis causes the abdominal muscles to become rigid and board-like. Every movement agony, fever would spike as the body's immune system fought the infection. Nausea and vomiting would follow as the digestive system shut down. Eventually, septic shock would set in, blood pressure dropping, organs failing one by one. Modern historians question the accuracy of this account. No contemporary sources mention it, and the story doesn't appear in writing until decades after Edmund's death. It's possible the tale was invented to humiliate Edmund's memory, or to make his death seem particularly shameful, dying in a toilet covered in filth. But medieval chronicles generally agreed on the basic facts. Edmund died of wounds to his lower body, and his death involved a toilet. Whether the exact details are true or embellished, the method of death, a blade through the anus, was a real assassination technique. It had several advantages for the killer. It was fatal, it was humiliating, and it required the victim to be alone and vulnerable. If Edmund truly died this way, his last moments were spent in agony, bleeding from wounds to his most private areas, dying slowly from an infection he couldn't see or fight. The Cadaver Synod. In January 897, Pope Stephen VI ordered the corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, exhumed and put on trial. This wasn't symbolic. The decomposed body of Formosus, dead for 9 months, was dressed in papal vestments, propped up in a chair in the papal court, and formally charged with crimes including perjury and ascending to the papacy illegally. Formosus's corpse couldn't defend itself, so a deacon was appointed to speak for him. The trial was a farce, with Stephen VI screaming accusations at the rotting body while the appointed defender gave weak responses. The corpse sat silently, held upright by attendants, its flesh blackened and partially decomposed, jaw hanging open, dressed in the ceremonial robes of the papacy. The verdict was predetermined. Formosus was found guilty on all charges. Stephen VI then ordered that the 3 fingers of the right hand that Formosus had used to give blessings be cut off. Attendants stepped forward and hacked at the desiccated hand, severing the blessing fingers from the corpse. The fingers, dried and leathery, were removed and thrown away. But Stephen wasn't finished. He ordered the body stripped of its papal vestments and redressed in peasant clothes. Then the corpse was dragged through the streets of Rome, mocked by crowds who had been told that this rotting thing had been a false pope. The body, falling apart from decomposition and rough handling, left a trail of decomposed matter as it was pulled through the city. Finally, the remains were thrown into the Tiber River. But the humiliation didn't end there. Some sources say the body washed ashore and a monk recovered it, giving it a proper burial. Other sources claim the corpse was recovered by supporters of Formosus and became a rallying point against Stephen VI. The Cadaver Synod had consequences. The Roman people, disgusted by the trial and desecration, revolted. Stephen VI was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled to death in August 897, just months after the Synod. Formosus's body was eventually recovered and reburied in St. Peter's Basilica with full honours. The gruesome nature of the Cadaver Synod lies not in physical torture of a living person, but in the violation of a corpse, the mockery of death, and the psychological horror of a trial where the accused couldn't defend himself because he was dead. The image of a 9-month-old corpse, decomposing and falling apart, dressed in papal finery and propped up in a courtroom, remains one of the most bizarre and unsettling events in papal history. The death of Joan of Arc. On May 30th, 1431, 19-year-old Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in Rouen marketplace. The English wanted her dead for heresy, witchcraft and cross-dressing, but mostly for the military victories she had led against them. Her death was designed to be public, brutal and final, ensuring no relics remained for her followers to venerate. Joan was led to a tall scaffold specially constructed for her execution. Unlike most burnings where the victim stood on or near the ground, Joan's pyre was elevated so high that the executioner couldn't reach her to strangle her before the fire took hold. A small mercy typically granted to those condemned to burn. This wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate. The English wanted her to burn alive, fully conscious, with no chance of a quick death. Wood was piled around her legs, reaching up to her waist. She was bound to a tall stake, unable to move. A paper crown was placed on her head, inscribed with her crimes: heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater. A witness described her asking for a cross, and an English soldier made one from sticks, which she held as the fire was lit. The flames began at her feet. Fire travels upward, meaning her lower body burned first. Witnesses described her crying out to God and the saints, particularly invoking St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. The heat would have been unbearable, her skin blistered and blackened. The smell of burning flesh filled the marketplace. Her legs burned first, the fire consuming flesh and muscle, eventually exposing bone. As the fire rose higher, it reached her torso. Her dress caught fire, burning away to expose her body to the crowd. A final humiliation. The fire damaged her lungs as she inhaled superheated air and smoke. Each breath would have seared her airways. Her screams became weaker as her lungs were destroyed. The executioner, Geoffroy Terrage, later testified that he was deeply disturbed by her death. He claimed that even as the fire consumed her body, she continued calling out to God. Some witnesses reported that at the moment of death, they saw a dove fly from the flames, which they interpreted as her soul ascending to heaven. Others saw only a young woman burning to death in agony. But the English weren't satisfied with her death. They ordered the executioner to rake back the flames and show Joan's charred corpse to the crowd, proving she was truly dead and not spirited away by supernatural means. Her blackened body, partially consumed by fire, was displayed to hundreds of witnesses. Then the fire was relit, and her body was burned again, reducing it to ash and bone fragments. Even then, the English weren't finished. They ordered the executioner to gather her ashes and remaining bone fragments and throw them into the Seine River, ensuring no relics survived. Her body was scattered in the water, dissolved and dispersed, and attempt to erase her from existence. Joan's death became legendary. In 1456, 25 years after her execution, the Catholic Church conducted a retrial and declared her innocent. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint. The English soldier who had made her a cross from the sticks reportedly confessed that he was certain he had burned a saint and feared for his soul. Geoffroy Terrage, the executioner, said he was afraid for his own damnation and had nightmares of her burning for the rest of his life. Hisashi Ouchi. On September 30th, 1999, nuclear technician Hisashi Ouchi and two colleagues were purifying uranium at a fuel processing plant in Tokaimura, Japan, when a criticality accident occurred. A flash of blue light filled the room as an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction began. Ouchi received a dose of radiation estimated at 17 sieverts, far beyond what any human had survived. What followed was 83 days of medical intervention that pushed the boundaries of ethical medicine and turned Ouchi's body into a grotesque demonstration of what radiation does to human tissue. Radiation at that level destroys DNA. Ouchi's cells lost the ability to repair or regenerate themselves. Within hours, his body began to fall apart at the cellular level, his chromosomes shattered, examined under microscope, and found to be completely scrambled, unrecognizable as human DNA. Without functional DNA, his cells couldn't divide, couldn't replace themselves. He was alive, but his body was already dying from the inside out. The first signs were relatively minor: nausea, vomiting, unconsciousness, but within days the real horror began. His skin, unable to regenerate, began to slough off. The outermost layer peeled away, leaving raw flesh exposed, then the next layer, and the next. Medical staff wrapped him in bandages, but the skin underneath continued to die and fall away. His body began weeping fluid from every surface, as the skin barrier that prevents moisture loss disintegrated. His intestinal lining, which normally regenerates every few days, stopped replacing itself. The lining died and sloughed off into his digestive tract. Without an intestinal lining, he couldn't absorb nutrients or water. He began suffering from severe diarrhea as the dead tissue passed through his system. His digestive tract from mouth to anus became an open wound. Doctors attempted skin grafts, but the grafted skin died immediately. His body couldn't support it. They tried blood transfusions, but his bone marrow, which produces blood cells, had been destroyed by radiation. He required multiple transfusions daily just to keep him alive. His white blood cell count dropped to 0, leaving him with no immune system. Infections began, and with no immune response, they spread unchecked. His lungs began to fail, the tissue breaking down. He was placed on a ventilator, but the breathing tube damaged his throat, which couldn't heal. His mouth and throat became ulcerated, bleeding continuously. He couldn't speak, couldn't swallow, could barely breathe, even with mechanical assistance. His heart stopped 3 times, and each time doctors revived him. His family, hoping for a miracle, asked doctors to continue treatment. The medical team, driven by a combination of hope, scientific curiosity, and ethical obligation, complied. They tried experimental treatments, including stem cell transfusions, trying to restart his body's ability to regenerate tissue. Nothing worked. By the end, Ouchi's body was barely recognizable as human. His skin was gone, replaced by weeping sores. His internal organs were failing one by one. He had lost most of his body fluids and had to be continuously infused with replacement fluids. His face was swollen beyond recognition, his eyes sunken. He was kept sedated because the pain would have been unendurable. On December 21st, 1999, 83 days after the accident, his heart finally stopped for the last time, and doctors did not revive him. His body had endured more than 3 months of continuous cellular death, kept artificially alive by machines and constant medical intervention. Some medical ethicists later questioned whether the prolonged treatment constituted torture, keeping a man alive who had no chance of survival, whose body was quite literally falling apart. The autopsy revealed that almost none of his internal organs were functional. His chromosomes were so badly damaged that they were described as looking like scrambled eggs under a microscope. Ouchi's death stands as one of the most prolonged and agonizing in modern medical history, a demonstration of both the horror of high-dose radiation and the ethical questions surrounding medical intervention when survival is impossible. The death of Junko Furuta. On November 25, 1988, 17-year-old Junko Furuta was kidnapped by 4 teenage boys in Misato, Japan. What followed over the next 44 days remains one of the most horrific crimes ever documented. The torture was so extreme, prolonged, and sadistic that medical examiners later testified they had never seen a body so brutalized. The boys held Junko in a house owned by one of their parents, who were allegedly present but did nothing to help her. The torture began immediately. They raped her repeatedly, hundreds of times over the course of her captivity, but the sexual assault was only one aspect of her suffering. They burned her with cigarettes, lighters, and hot wax, covering her body in burn wounds. They forced her to drink her own urine and eat cockroaches. They inserted foreign objects into her, causing severe internal injuries. The violence escalated continuously. They beat her with golf clubs and bamboo sticks, breaking her bones. They held her feet over flames until the skin burned away, exposing muscle and bone. They dropped heavy barbells on her stomach, damaging her internal organs. They poured lighter fluid on her legs and set her on fire, burning her severely enough that she couldn't walk. When she tried to phone for help, they broke her hands as punishment, crushing her fingers until the bones splintered. The assault on January 4th, 1989 proved fatal. In a bout of particularly savage violence, the boys beat her with iron bars, kicked her repeatedly in the chest and face, and dropped a heavy iron ball on her stomach. Her injuries were catastrophic. Her face was so swollen that it was unrecognizable. Her internal organs were damaged beyond repair. She lost consciousness and never woke up. Instead of calling for medical help, the boys realized she was either dead or dying and panicked. They wrapped her body in a blanket, put it in a 55-gallon drum, filled it with concrete, and dumped it in a vacant lot in Koto, Tokyo. When her body was finally discovered on March 29, 1989, over 2 months after her death, the medical examination revealed the full extent of her suffering. Her body was so badly decomposed and damaged that identification was difficult. Burn wounds covered approximately 60% of her body. Her internal organs showed extensive trauma. Her brain had shrunk from the repeated blows to her head. Investigators found evidence of over 100 different wounds. The medical examiner estimated she had been raped over 400 times during her captivity. The concrete had preserved some tissue, allowing pathologists to document injuries that told the story of her torture. The 4 perpetrators were arrested and convicted, but because they were juveniles at the time of the crime, their sentences were shockingly light, ranging from 4 to 20 years. The lenient sentences caused public outrage. After their release, several of the perpetrators went on to commit other violent crimes, suggesting they had learned nothing from their imprisonment. Junko Furuta's death represents one of the most extreme examples of human cruelty ever documented by law enforcement. The 44 days she endured torture, rape, and mutilation before finally dying from her injuries stand as a testament to both the capacity for evil that exists in some individuals and the failure of justice systems to adequately punish such crimes. Griselidis Real's account of Nazi torture. While Griselidis Real survived her torture by the Gestapo during World War II, her detailed accounts describe deaths of other prisoners that reveal the systematic brutality of Nazi interrogation methods. Real was arrested as part of the French resistance and held at various Gestapo facilities where she witnessed and experienced torture designed not just to extract information, but to break the human spirit. The most common method was suspension torture. Prisoners' hands were bound behind their backs, and then they were hung from a ceiling hook by their wrists. The entire body weight pulled on the shoulders, dislocating them with a distinctive popping sound. The pain was described as beyond description, every muscle in the upper body tearing, tendons stretching past their limits. Prisoners hung this way, for hours, sometimes days, being lowered only to be interrogated and then raised again. Real described one woman who was suspended for so long that her arms, deprived of blood flow, began to turn black with necrosis. The flesh died while she still lived, gangrene setting in, the smell of rotting tissue filling the cell. When she was finally cut down, she collapsed, both shoulders dislocated, her arms useless. She died 2 days later from infection and shock, her body unable to recover from the trauma. Another method was the bathtub torture. Prisoners were held face down in bathtubs filled with ice-cold water, held under until they were on the verge of drowning, then pulled up to gasp for air before being submerged again. The cycle repeated until prisoners either talked or lost consciousness. Real described watching a man drown during this torture. The Gestapo officer holding him under miscalculated the timing, and when they pulled him up, he didn't gasp for air. Water poured from his mouth and nose. They tried to revive him, not out of mercy, but because they weren't finished questioning him, but his lungs were full of water and he was already brain dead. He died without regaining consciousness. Electric shock torture was reserved for those who continued to resist. Electrodes were attached to sensitive areas: genitals, nipples, lips, earlobes. The current sent through the body caused muscles to contract violently, bones sometimes breaking from the force of the contractions. Real described prisoners screaming so loudly and for so long that their vocal cords ruptured, leaving them unable to make sound, their mouths opening and closing in silent agony. One particularly brutal method involved placing prisoners' fingers in desk drawers and slamming them shut repeatedly, crushing fingers bone by bone. The psychological effect was devastating. Prisoners could watch their own hands being destroyed, bones splintered and pushed through skin, knowing that even if they survived, they would be permanently crippled. Real survived, but many of those imprisoned with her did not. She described bodies being carried out of interrogation rooms, some still breathing, but so badly injured that death was inevitable. The Gestapo made no effort to provide medical care. Prisoners who couldn't walk were dragged back to their cells and left to die. Those who died during interrogation were stripped of anything valuable and thrown into unmarked graves, or burned. The brutality wasn't random, it was systematic, refined through years of practice, designed to maximize suffering while keeping prisoners alive long enough to extract information. The fact that many prisoners died, despite these efforts, speaks to the extremity of the torture. Bodies can only endure so much before systems begin to fail. Shock setting in, organs shutting down, death coming as a mercy after hours or days of agony. Sawing, one of the most brutal execution methods ever devised, involved hanging the condemned upside down and sawing them in half lengthwise, starting at the groin. This method was used in various cultures, from medieval Europe to parts of Asia, and its cruelty lay in the extended consciousness of the victim due to the inverted position. When hung upside down, blood rushes to the brain, keeping it oxygenated and the victim conscious far longer than would be possible in an upright position. The executioners would use a large two-person saw, beginning at the genitals or anus, and cutting downward through the body. The saw teeth tore through flesh, muscle, and bone, splitting the body symmetrically. The first cut through the genital region would be excruciating, but not immediately fatal. As the saw descended, it would split the pelvis, cutting through bone with a sound witnesses described as similar to sawing wood, but wetter, accompanied by the victim's screams. Blood flowed freely, but the inverted position prevented the victim from bleeding out quickly, maintaining consciousness. As the saw reached the abdomen, it would slice through intestines and organs. The victim could see the executioners working, see their own body being divided, smell the blood and released bowel contents. The saw cut through the liver, stomach, and spleen, each organ adding its own colour to the blood flowing from the wound. Witnesses described victims remaining conscious even as the saw reached their chest cavity, cutting through the diaphragm and into the lungs. Death usually came when the saw reached the heart or lungs, when blood loss and oxygen deprivation finally overcame the victim. But depending on the skill of the executioners and the position of the cut, some victims reportedly remained alive and aware, even as the saw split their sternum, finally dying when the brain itself was bisected. Historical records from medieval Europe describe this execution being used for crimes including murder, treason, and in some cases, adultery. The execution was always public, designed to horrify onlookers and deter crime. The slow speed of the sawing, sometimes taking 30 minutes or more, meant crowds watched the entire process, from the first cut to the final separation of the body into two halves. In some variations, the cut was made vertically down the spine rather than through the front of the body, but this method was actually faster and thus considered more merciful. The preferred method for maximum suffering was the front to back cut, ensuring the victim saw everything happening to them. The practice was eventually abandoned not out of mercy, but because authorities recognized that such extreme brutality could incite rebellion rather than prevent it. But for centuries, sawing remained in the catalogue of execution methods, a testament to human creativity in devising ways to inflict maximum suffering. The Blood Eagle. According to Norse sagas, the Blood Eagle was one of the most horrific execution methods attributed to the Vikings. While historians debate whether it was actually performed or simply a literary device, the sagas describe it in enough detail to reconstruct what it would have entailed. The victim was placed face down, and the executioner cut through the skin and muscle of the back, following the line of the spine. The ribs were then carefully cut away from the spine using an axe or sword, each rib on both sides being separated from the vertebrae. This required precision. Cut too deeply, and you sever the spinal cord, killing the victim too quickly. Cut too shallowly, and the ribs won't separate. Once the ribs were cut free, they were bent outward and backward, breaking them away from the sternum and spreading them like wings. The victim's lungs, still functioning, were then pulled out through the opening and draped over the wings formed by the ribs. The lungs, exposed to air and collapsed, would flutter with each attempted breath, creating the eagle effect. If performed as described, the victim would remain conscious for minutes. The pain would be unimaginable. Every nerve in the back would be firing, the spinal cord exposed, but not severed, the broken ribs grinding with each breath. the lungs collapsing and attempting to inflate outside the body cavity. Death would come from a combination of blood loss, shock, and inability to breathe effectively with lungs no longer protected by the ribcage. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok describes his son, Ivar the Boneless, performing the Blood Eagle on King Ella of Northumbria in revenge for Ragnar's death. The saga claims Ella remained conscious throughout the procedure, neither crying out nor begging for mercy. Whether this detail is historical or literary flourish is unknown, but it established the Blood Eagle as the ultimate Viking expression of revenge and dishonour. Modern scholars point out that the description in sagas may have been metaphorical rather than literal, possibly describing wounds inflicted in battle being poeticized into a formal execution ritual. However, archaeological evidence of bodies with rib damage consistent with the Blood Eagle description has been discovered, suggesting it may have been performed at least occasionally. The Blood Eagle appears in sagas as punishment for the most serious crimes, particularly the murder of one's father or king. The exposure of the lungs, the organs of breath and life, had symbolic significance in Norse culture, representing the victim's life force being displayed for all to see as it fled the body. Whether myth or reality, the Blood Eagle has endured as one of history's most gruesome execution methods, a symbol of Viking brutality that may or may not have actually been practiced, but nonetheless captures the imagination with its visceral horror. The Donner Party. In the winter of 1846 to 1847, a group of American pioneers attempting to reach California became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains by early snowfall. What began as a migration turned into one of the most infamous survival situations in American history, culminating in cannibalism and death by starvation and exposure. The Donner Party, named after George Donner, consisted of approximately 87 people. When early snow trapped them in November 1846, they were forced to make camp at what is now called Donner Lake. The snow continued falling, eventually reaching 20 feet deep, making travel impossible. They were trapped until spring. Food ran out quickly. The party killed and ate their oxen and horses. Then they ate the pack animals, then the dogs. Then they boiled leather hides to make a gelatinous soup that provided minimal nutrition. As weeks turned to months and the snow showed no signs of stopping, people began to starve to death. Starvation is a slow, agonizing death. The body consumes its own fat reserves first, then muscle tissue, then begins breaking down organs to sustain the brain and heart. Victims become skeletal, skin stretched over bones, eyes sunken deep into skulls. Cognitive function declines. Hallucinations begin. The digestive system shuts down. Any food that is eaten can't be properly processed by a body that has forgotten how to digest. The first deaths came in December. When the bodies were buried in the snow, they preserved in the freezing temperatures. As more people died and starvation became desperate, survivors made a horrific decision. They would eat the dead. Initial accounts claim the cannibalism was limited to eating those who had already died, never killing someone for food. Survivors later testified that they cut flesh from the corpses of their companions, roasted it over fires, and ate it to survive. Some refused and died. Others participated and lived. But darker accounts emerged later. Louis Kesselberg, one of the survivors, was accused of murder and cannibalism. He was allegedly found with human flesh in his cabin and fat rendered from human bodies. Some evidence suggests he didn't just eat the already dead, but may have hastened the death of those too weak to resist, killing them for food. The rescue parties that finally reached the camps in February and March 1847 found scenes of horror. Human bones with the flesh boiled off lay scattered around cabins. Skulls were cracked open to access the brains. Bodies were found with legs and arms removed, the meat stripped away. One rescuer wrote that it was the most horrifying scene he had ever witnessed, worse than any battlefield. Of the 87 original members of the Donner Party, only 48 survived. The survivors were skeletal, barely alive, some having resorted to eating family members to stay living. The psychological trauma was profound. Many survivors never spoke publicly about their experiences. the shame and horror of what they had been forced to do to survive haunting them for the rest of their lives. The Donner Party's fate became a cautionary tale, but also a testament to the extreme conditions that can drive ordinary people to the most taboo acts. The deaths weren't quick or clean, they were slow starvation, bodies wasting away over months, reduced to eating their own dead to survive just a few more days in the snow. Medical experiments at Unit 731. During World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a covert research program called Unit 731 in Manchuria. Under the direction of microbiologist Shiro Ishii, the unit conducted biological warfare research using human subjects. The experiments resulted in at least 10,000 deaths, and the methods were so brutal that American authorities, who later learned of them, granted immunity to the researchers in exchange for their data, rather than prosecuting them for war crimes. Vivisection experiments were routine. Vivisection means surgery on living subjects without anesthesia. Researchers wanted to see how organs functioned in living humans, so they would strap subjects to tables and dissect them while they were fully conscious. Victims screamed and struggled as their abdomens were opened, organs examined and removed one by one to see how long the body could survive without each organ. Frostbite experiments involved freezing prisoners' limbs and then testing rewarming methods. Subjects were taken outside in winter, their arms or legs exposed to freezing temperatures until the tissue died. Then researchers would test various methods of thawing the frozen limbs. Immersion in hot water, gradual warming, even striking the frozen limbs with sticks to shatter them like ice. The screaming from these experiments could be heard throughout the facility. Pressure chamber experiments placed subjects in sealed chambers where pressure could be controlled. Researchers wanted to see what happened to the human body at various pressures. In low-pressure conditions, subjects' eyes would bulge from their sockets as internal pressure pushed outward. Intestines would prolapse through the anus. At high pressure, subjects would be crushed, their bodies compressed as the pressure exceeded what human tissue could withstand. Infection experiments deliberately exposed subjects to diseases including plague, cholera, and anthrax. Researchers would then observe the progression of disease without treatment, documenting symptoms until death. Some subjects were dissected while still alive to see the effects of disease on internal organs. Pregnant women were infected to see how diseases passed to fetuses. Weapons testing used live prisoners as targets. Flamethrowers were tested on bound subjects to measure burn patterns. Grenades were detonated at various distances from subjects to measure shrapnel wounds. Chemical weapons were tested in sealed chambers, researchers watching through windows as subjects choked and died from poison gas. Perhaps most horrifying were the field tests, where prisoners were tied to stakes in a field and subjected to biological bombs. Plague-infected fleas were dispersed, and subjects were monitored as they contracted and died from the disease. The data was used to refine Japan's biological weapons program. After the war, American authorities learned of Unit 731's experiments and made a calculated decision. Instead of prosecuting the researchers as war criminals, they granted them immunity in exchange for their data. The reasoning was that the research, though horrific, was scientifically valuable and had been conducted on a scale impossible to replicate ethically. The Soviet Union prosecuted some Unit 731 members they captured, but most of the primary researchers, including Shiro Ishii, never faced justice. Many went on to prominent careers in post-war Japan's pharmaceutical and medical industries. The victims of Unit 731 received no justice. Their bodies were destroyed, burned, or buried in mass graves. The experiments remained largely secret until the 1980s, when former Unit 731 members began confessing. Their testimonies revealed the full scope of the atrocities, systematic torture and murder disguised as medical research, conducted on thousands of people who were referred to as logs, not humans. The death of Grigory Rasputin, alternative account. An alternative and possibly more accurate account of Rasputin's death, based on autopsy reports that have since been examined by modern forensic experts, suggests the legendary tale of his invincibility was largely fabricated by his killers to justify their actions and make themselves seem more heroic. The autopsy report, conducted by Professor Dmitry Kosorotov, revealed that Rasputin died from a single gunshot wound to the head. The other wounds, including gunshots to the chest and liver, were either post-mortem or delivered when he was already dying. There was no evidence of poison in his system, suggesting the cyanide story was fabricated or the poison simply wasn't administered effectively. What the autopsy did reveal was that Rasputin was alive when he entered the water. His lungs contained water, meaning he drew breath while submerged. This suggests a different, possibly more horrifying scenario. After being shot in the head, Rasputin was not quite dead. The bullet entered his forehead, but may have struck at an angle that avoided immediately fatal damage to the brain. He was unconscious, or nearly so, but not dead. In their panic and haste to dispose of the body, the conspirators wrapped him while he was still alive and threw him through the ice. The shock of the freezing water may have briefly revived him. Trapped under the ice, unable to break through, he would have inhaled water. His death was by drowning, alone in darkness beneath the ice, his lungs burning as frigid water filled them. When his body was recovered 3 days later, his arms were positioned in a way that suggested he had tried to free himself from the cloth wrapped around him. One arm was raised, bent at the elbow, as if he had been trying to claw his way out. This position, frozen by death and cold, suggested that Rasputin had been at least partially conscious under the ice, struggling against his bindings in the final moments before drowning. This account, less legendary but more supported by forensic evidence, paints an even more tragic picture. Rasputin didn't die as a near supernatural figure who required poison, shooting, beating, and drowning. He died as a man shot in the head, possibly not fatally, and then drowned under ice while still alive, his killers too panicked or too incompetent to ensure he was actually dead before disposal. The fabricated story of his invincibility served the conspirators' purposes, making them seem like they had battled a monster rather than murdered a wounded man. But the truth, revealed by forensic analysis decades later, suggests his death was perhaps more cruel. Shot, thrown in a river while still breathing, drowning in darkness and cold, alone. The Colombian necktie. During the period of violence in Colombia known as La Violencia, 1948-1958, and later during the drug wars, a particularly brutal form of execution and mutilation emerged called the Colombian necktie. This method was designed not just to kill, but to terrorize, leaving bodies as warnings. The victim, sometimes already dead but often still alive, was restrained. The killer made a deep cut across the throat from ear to ear, severing the windpipe and esophagus, but being careful not to cut so deeply as to sever the spinal cord, which would cause immediate death. The tongue was then pulled through the wound, hanging down over the chest like a grotesque tie. When performed on living victims, death was neither quick nor painless. The cut throat meant the victim couldn't scream, air escaping through the wound rather than the vocal cords. They would drown in their own blood, choking and gasping as blood filled their lungs and airway. The brain, still receiving oxygen from the carotid arteries if they hadn't been completely severed, kept the victim conscious for minutes, aware of what had been done to them, feeling their tongue pulled through the wound in their throat. The psychological effect was the primary purpose. Bodies left with Colombian neckties were found by family members, witnesses, or authorities. The gruesome display a clear message. This is what happens to informants, to rival cartel members, to anyone who opposes us. The technique spread beyond Colombia, used by drug cartels in Mexico and street gangs in the United States, though less frequently in modern times due to increased law enforcement response. Forensic pathologists who examined victims of Colombian neckties noted that the level of brutality suggested these were often not clean executions, but torture killings. Some victims showed signs of other injuries, suggesting they were beaten or tortured before the necktie was inflicted. In cases where the victim was alive when the cut was made, the struggle was evident in the wound patterns, defensive wounds on hands, and signs of restraint. The Colombian necktie became a symbol of the extreme violence of the drug wars, a signature kill that indicated cartel involvement. While its use has declined, it remains part of the historical record of human cruelty. a technique designed not just to kill, but to mutilate and terrorize, turning the human body into a message. The death of Robert François Damiens. On March 2nd, 1757, Robert François Damiens attempted to assassinate King Louis the Moisson of France with a small knife. The wound was superficial, barely breaking the skin, but the crime of regicide demanded the most extreme punishment imaginable. What followed was one of the most meticulously documented executions in history, witnessed by thousands and described in horrifying detail by contemporary observers. Damiens was sentenced to be executed in the Place de Grève in Paris. The execution began with torture designed to extract confessions and information about co-conspirators, though Damiens insisted he acted alone. His right hand, which had held the knife, was burned with sulphur until the flesh charred and fell away, exposing bone. He screamed continuously during this process, which lasted several minutes. Then came the main execution. Damiens was stripped and laid on a scaffold. Executioners used red-hot pincers to tear flesh from his chest, arms, thighs, and calves. The pincers, heated until they glowed, were clamped onto his skin and muscle, then twisted and pulled, ripping away chunks of flesh. Contemporary accounts describe the smell of burning and torn flesh filling the square. Damiens shrieked with each application of the pincers, his body convulsing. Into the open wounds, executioners poured molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and a mixture of melted wax and sulphur. The liquid seared the exposed muscle and bone, cauterizing some wounds while creating new agony. Witnesses described seeing the fluids bubble in the wounds, steam rising from his body. Damiens lost consciousness multiple times and was revived with smelling salts to ensure he experienced the full punishment. The final phase involved drawing and quartering. 4 horses were harnessed to his limbs, 1 to each arm and leg. The horses were whipped and driven in different directions, meant to tear his body apart. But Damiens' joints and ligaments were stronger than expected. For over an hour, the horses pulled, stretching his body but not separating the limbs. His shoulders and hips dislocated, tendons stretched to the breaking point, but the limbs remained attached. Executioners had to use knives to cut through the muscles and tendons at his joints while the horses continued pulling. Even then, it took enormous effort. His legs finally separated first, ripped from his torso at the hips as horses dragged them away. Then his arms, pulled from their sockets and torn free. Throughout this process, witnesses reported that Damiens remained conscious, his torso writhing on the scaffold, legless and armless, bleeding from 4 massive wounds. His torso, still alive according to some witnesses, was thrown onto a pyre and burned. Whether he was still conscious when the flames consumed him remains debated, but physician observers noted that his chest continued to move with breath even after his limbs had been torn away. The execution lasted over 4 hours from start to finish. The brutality of Damiens' execution shocked even 18th century observers accustomed to public executions. It became a rallying point for critics of torture and cruel punishment. Cited by Enlightenment philosophers as evidence of judicial barbarism, it was one of the last executions of its kind in France. Public opinion turning against such extreme displays of violence. The Erfurt latrine disaster. On July 26, 1184, King Henry VI of Germany held a royal council in Erfurt, gathering nobles in the Church of St. Peter. Approximately 60 nobles and knights assembled in an upper floor room to discuss matters of state. The room was built above the church's latrine cesspit, a common architectural feature where waste fell through holes into a pit below. What happened next was both tragically absurd and horrifically gruesome. The floor, weakened by rot and the weight of dozens of armoured men, suddenly collapsed. Nobles, knights and clergy plunged through the wooden floor into the cesspit below, a deep pit filled with years of accumulated human waste. Contemporary chronicles describe the scene as chaos. Men fell through the floor screaming, disappearing into the darkness of the pit. Some landed on wooden beams and were impaled. Others fell directly into the sewage, which was deep enough to drown in. The pit was approximately 15 to 20 feet deep, filled with decomposing human waste that had the consistency of thick mud. Those who fell into it found themselves unable to swim or wade through the dense, semi-solid filth. The weight of their armor pulled them down. Men thrashed and struggled, but each movement pulled them deeper into the sewage. The smell was overwhelming, causing many to vomit, which only filled their mouths and lungs with filth as they tried to breathe. Some men drowned in excrement, their mouths and noses clogged with human waste as they gasped for air. Others suffocated as the weight of sewage pressed down on them, filling their armor. Chronicles report that the screaming from the pit was terrible, men calling for help while drowning in filth. Those who hadn't fallen through watched helplessly, unable to reach their colleagues without risking falling in themselves. King Henry VI survived only because he was standing near a stone window alcove that didn't collapse. He watched as his nobles fell through the floor. Rescue efforts began immediately, but the confined space and depth of the pit made it nearly impossible. Some men were pulled out alive, covered in sewage, traumatized but breathing. Others were pulled out dead, drowned, or suffocated. The death toll varies by source, but most chronicles agree that approximately 60 people died in the cesspit. The bodies, when recovered, were found to have drowned in sewage, their lungs filled with liquid human waste. The humiliation of the death matched its horror. Nobles and knights who had survived battles and tournaments dying by drowning in a toilet. The incident became known as the Erfurter Latrinensturz, the Erfurt latrine fall. It was recorded in multiple medieval chronicles, including the Chronica Regia Coloniensis and chronicles by Arnold of Lübeck. The disaster led to changes in architectural practices for large gathering halls, but it remains one of history's most bizarre and undignified mass deaths. The death of Balthazar Gerard. On July 10, 1584, Balthazar Gerard assassinated William I of Orange, shooting him with a pistol in Delft. Gerard was immediately captured and faced an execution designed to be as prolonged and painful as possible, both as punishment and as a deterrent to future would-be assassins. The torture began immediately after his capture. His arms were placed in screws that slowly crushed his hands and forearms, breaking bones gradually over hours. He was placed in a dark cell without food, given only a minimum of water mixed with vinegar to keep him alive but in constant discomfort. After days of preliminary torture, his formal execution was scheduled. On July 14, 1584, Gerard was brought to the market square in Delft. The execution was designed to last as long as possible. First, his right hand, which had held the pistol, was burned off with a red-hot iron. The executioner pressed the glowing metal against his hand, holding it there as the flesh sizzled and burned. The smell of cooking meat filled the square. Gerard's hand was reduced to a charred stump, the bones exposed and blackened. Next, his flesh was torn from his bones using red-hot pincers. Starting with his arms, executioners clamped the pincers onto his muscle and twisted, ripping away chunks of flesh. The process moved methodically across his body, each piece of torn flesh leaving a raw, bleeding wound. The pincers, kept hot throughout the process, cauterized some wounds while creating others, filling the air with smoke and the stench of burning flesh. After the flaying came disembowelment. While Gerard was still conscious, executioners made an incision in his abdomen and pulled out his intestines. The process was slow, the intestines drawn out foot by foot while Gerard watched. He reportedly remained conscious throughout, his screams weakening as shock began to set in, but never fully stopping. The next phase involved quartering. His body was tied to a large wooden cross and positioned for dismemberment. Unlike some quartering where horses pull the limbs, Gerard's limbs were sawed off while he still lived. The executioners used a large saw to cut through his right leg at the thigh, sawing through muscle and bone while Gerard remained conscious. Then the left leg, then each arm, sawing through the joints, the sound of the saw cutting through bone audible across the square. After his limbs were removed, his torso was cut open, and his heart was removed and shown to the crowd. This was finally the moment of death, his brain starved of oxygen as the heart stopped beating. But the mutilation continued post-mortem. His head was cut off and displayed on a pike. His body parts were distributed to different cities to be displayed as warnings. Contemporary accounts describe Gérard as remaining conscious for most of the execution, which lasted over 2 hours. Witnesses reported that he made no sound after the initial screams, suffering in silence as his body was systematically destroyed. The execution was so brutal that even some who supported William of Orange questioned whether such extreme punishment was justified, though others argued that regicide demanded the ultimate punishment: the death of Agrippina the Younger. In 59 CE, the Roman Emperor Nero decided to murder his mother, Agrippina the Younger. Their relationship had become strained as she lost influence over him, and Nero feared she was plotting against him. What followed was a botched assassination attempt, followed by a brutal execution that shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial violence. Nero's first attempt was ingenious, but failed. He had a boat constructed with a collapsible ceiling, designed to fall and crush Agrippina while she slept during a sea voyage. The boat was taken out into the Bay of Naples at night, and the mechanism was triggered. The ceiling collapsed, but it killed Agrippina's maid instead. Agrippina, though injured, managed to swim to shore. Realizing the accident was an assassination attempt, she sent word to Nero claiming she had survived a terrible mishap, testing whether he would openly try again. Nero panicked. He couldn't allow her to live now that she knew he had tried to kill her. He sent a squadron of soldiers, led by Anistus, a naval commander, to her villa at Bauli. The soldiers broke into her bedroom in the early morning hours. Agrippina knew immediately why they had come. Contemporary accounts describe her demanding to speak with Nero, insisting that she be taken to her son. The soldiers ignored her pleas. She reportedly opened her robe and pointed to her womb, shouting, "Strike here! Strike the womb that bore Nero!" The soldiers obliged. They stabbed her repeatedly in the abdomen, the blades punching through her stomach, intestines, and uterus. The symbolism was clear. They destroyed the womb that had given birth to the emperor. She collapsed, bleeding from multiple stab wounds, but she didn't die immediately. The wounds, while fatal, weren't instantly so. She bled out over several minutes, conscious and aware, dying on the floor of her bedroom. Her body was cremated that same night, hastily and without ceremony. Nero, when informed of her death, reportedly went to view the corpse. Ancient sources claim he examined her body critically, commenting on her physical features in a manner that disturbed even his supporters. Some accounts suggest he ordered the body positioned in obscene ways before cremation, adding a final indignity to the murder. The murder of Agrippina shocked Roman society. She had been instrumental in Nero's rise to power, poisoning her husband, Emperor Claudius, to place Nero on the throne. Her death at her son's orders was seen as both matricide and a violation of the most fundamental Roman values. Nero attempted to justify the murder by claiming she had been plotting against him, but few believed it. The murder marked a turning point in Nero's reign, his transition from promising young emperor to the tyrannical figure history remembers. The Judas cradle. Medieval Europe developed numerous torture devices, but few were as insidious as the Judas cradle, also called the Judas chair. This device was designed to inflict maximum pain over an extended period without causing immediate death, allowing interrogators to extract confessions or simply punish victims with prolonged suffering. The device consisted of a tall pyramid-shaped seat with a sharpened point at the top. The victim was suspended above the point using ropes attached to their wrists, which were tied above their head. Then they were slowly lowered onto the pyramid, the point positioned to penetrate the anus, vagina, or scrotum. The victim's own body weight caused the point to slowly penetrate their body. The torture began as soon as contact was made. The sharp point pressed against the most sensitive areas of the body, causing immediate pain. As the victim was lowered further, or as they tired and their muscles could no longer support their weight, the point penetrated deeper. The pyramid shape meant that as it entered the body, it stretched and tore tissue, creating a wound that widened as penetration increased. The torture could last for hours or days. The victim was unable to lift themselves off the point for more than brief moments before exhaustion forced them to lower back down. Each time they lowered, the point penetrated deeper tearing through the rectum or vagina into the abdominal cavity. The pain was excruciating, but the position prevented them from passing out easily, as their body remained in a semi-upright position that maintained blood flow to the brain. Infection was inevitable. The point, rarely cleaned between victims, introduced bacteria deep into the body. As the penetration increased, intestinal contents could leak into the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis. The victim would develop fever, the wound becoming infected, pus and blood seeping from the penetration site. The combination of trauma, infection, and shock would eventually lead to death, but it could take days. Some interrogators enhanced the torture by adding weights to the victim's legs, increasing the downward pressure and accelerating penetration. Others would shake the device, causing the point to tear in different directions. In some cases, the point was deliberately made dull rather than sharp, causing even more tissue damage as it crushed and tore rather than cleanly piercing. Records from the Spanish Inquisition document use of the Judas cradle, though descriptions are often vague, referring to it obliquely in interrogation records. Confessions obtained under threat of the cradle were considered valid by church courts, the device serving both as punishment and interrogation tool. Victims who survived the Judas cradle often suffered permanent internal injuries, incontinence, and chronic pain from the damage to their pelvic floor and internal organs. The device was eventually abandoned, not because it was considered inhumane, but because medical understanding of infection and sepsis made it clear that many victims would die, regardless of their cooperation, limiting its usefulness as an interrogation tool. But for centuries, it remained in the arsenal of torturers across Europe, a testament to human ingenuity in creating suffering. The death of Jezebel. According to the biblical account in 2 Kings 9:30-37, corroborated by archaeological evidence of Iron Age Israelite practices, Jezebel, the Phoenician queen of Israel, met a death that was designed to be both humiliating and grotesque. While the account is religious in nature, archaeological discoveries and historical analysis of ancient Near Eastern execution practices suggest the core events are historically based. In approximately 842 BCE, Jehu, a military commander, staged a coup against the ruling family. When he arrived at Jezreel, Jezebel, knowing her death was imminent, dressed in royal finery, applied makeup, and arranged her hair, determined to die as a queen. She positioned herself at a high window of the palace, looking down at Jehu and his forces. Jehu called up to the window, asking who was on his side. Several of Jezebel's own eunuch servants appeared and signalled their loyalty to the usurper. Jehu gave a simple command: "Throw her down." The eunuch seized Jezebel and threw her from the high window. The fall was likely 30-40 feet, based on typical palace construction of the period. She fell head first. The impact with the stone pavement below shattered her skull and broke her neck, but biblical accounts suggest she survived the initial impact, at least briefly. Her body landed in the courtyard where Jehu's horses were gathered. He ordered his chariot driven forward and the horses trampled her body. Multiple horses, pulling chariots and ridden by soldiers, were driven over her deliberately, crushing her bones and pulping her flesh. The biblical account states that Jehu then went inside the palace to eat and drink, leaving Jezebel's body in the courtyard. When he finally ordered servants to bury her, they found that dogs had consumed most of the corpse. Only her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands remained, the dogs having eaten the rest. This fulfilled a prophecy that dogs would devour Jezebel and that her body would become like dung on the ground, unrecognizable and unburied. Archaeological evidence from sites in ancient Israel confirms that dogs in urban areas were often semi-feral scavengers that would feed on human remains if given the opportunity. The practice of leaving enemy corpses unburied for scavengers was a documented form of dishonor in ancient Near Eastern warfare. Jezebel's death, whether exactly as described or embellished in the retelling, represented the ultimate humiliation for a queen: death by defenestration, trampling, and consumption by dogs, her body so destroyed as to be nearly unidentifiable. The historical Jezebel was likely a powerful political figure whose promotion of Phoenician religious practices made her a target of Yahwehist religious factions. Her death marked a violent religious and political purge. The detailed description of her death in biblical texts and its archaeological context suggests that even if details were exaggerated, the core event, a queen thrown from a window, trampled and left for scavengers, represents a historical execution designed to humiliate and terrorize. The lead sprinkler, among the torture devices catalogued in European medieval and early modern period records, the lead sprinkler stands out for its deceptive simplicity and extreme cruelty. This device looked like a simple ladle or perforated container attached to a long handle, similar to a kitchen tool, but its purpose was far more sinister: to pour molten metal onto the restrained victim. The victim would be tied to a post or chair, unable to move. The torturer would heat lead, gold, silver, or other metals in a crucible until they liquefied. The molten metal, glowing yellow-white with heat and temperature exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit for lead or 1900 degrees for gold, would be scooped into the sprinkler device. The sprinkler had small holes that allowed the molten metal to pour out in streams rather than one mass, increasing the coverage area and prolonging the application. The molten metal would be poured over the victim's body. Common targets included the chest, abdomen, face, and genitals. The metal, still liquid but cooling rapidly, would sear through skin on contact, but unlike simple burning, the metal would pool in the contours of the body, collecting in the hollow of the throat, in the eye sockets, in the navel. As it cooled, it would solidify, adhering to the burned flesh. The pain was described as beyond any other form of burning. The metal didn't just burn the surface, it conducted heat deep into tissue, cooking flesh from the inside out. When poured on the chest, victims reported feeling their lungs burning, the heat conducting through the ribcage. When poured on the head, the skull itself heated, literally cooking the brain inside the cranium. If the victim survived the initial application, the cooled metal presented a new problem. It had fused to their burned flesh. Attempting to remove it would tear away the skin and tissue underneath. Many victims were left with the solidified metal embedded in their wounds, their bodies bearing the permanent scars of the torture. Infection was inevitable, the burned tissue becoming necrotic, the foreign metal in the wounds preventing proper healing. Records from the Holy Roman Empire document the use of lead sprinklers in executions for counterfeiting, a crime viewed as particularly serious because it threatened the economic system. The symbolism was clear. Those who dealt in false metals would be punished with true metal, the same material they had misused turned against them. Some records describe counterfeiters having molten metal poured into their mouths, literally filling them with the substance they had debased, choking and burning them from the inside. The lead sprinkler was also used in interrogations. The threat of its use was often enough to extract confessions, but when applied, it left victims permanently disfigured even if they survived. The psychological trauma combined with physical scarring ensured that survivors served as visible warnings to others, their melted and deformed flesh a testament to the consequences of certain crimes. The wheel breaking at St. Catherine. The Catherine wheel, named after St. Catherine of Alexandria, who was reportedly martyred on such a device, was a torture and execution method that involved systematically breaking every major bone in the victim's body before leaving them to die. The process was public, serving as both punishment and spectacle. The victim was laid on a large wooden wheel, their limbs stretched out and tied to the spokes. The executioner used a heavy iron bar or sledgehammer to break bones methodically. The process began with the extremities. The bones of the feet were shattered first, the executioner striking the top of the foot, crushing the small bones there. Then the ankles, the tibia and fibula splintering under the hammer's impact. The knees next, the patella shattered, ligaments torn. Each blow caused excruciating pain, but the victim remained conscious throughout. The executioner moved to the hands, breaking the delicate bones one by one. Then the wrists, then the forearms. The sound of breaking bone was audible to the crowd, a sickening crack accompanied by the victim's screams. The upper arms next, the humerus split by multiple blows. The executioner then moved to the torso. Ribs were broken one by one, the hammer striking each rib individually. This part of the torture was particularly dangerous as broken ribs could puncture lungs, causing the victim to drown in their own blood. Skilled executioners knew how to break ribs without immediately killing the victim, prolonging their suffering. After all major bones were broken, the victim was woven through the spokes of the wheel, their shattered limbs threaded between the wooden bars. This was possible because with broken bones, the limbs could bend in unnatural ways. The victim's broken body was contorted into a grotesque display, limbs at impossible angles, held in place by the wheel structure. The wheel was then mounted on a tall pole and displayed in a public place. The victim, still alive with all major bones broken, was left to die from exposure, shock, and internal injuries. Death could take hours or days. The victim would be conscious for much of it, experiencing unimaginable pain from dozens of broken bones, unable to move, their body contorted and displayed for public viewing. Dehydration, exposure to elements, and shock would eventually lead to death. Some victims were given a mercy stroke, a final blow to the chest or neck that would end their suffering earlier. This mercy was sometimes granted for political reasons or if the victim's crime was considered less severe, but many were left to die slowly, their broken bodies serving as warnings to others. The practice of breaking on the wheel continued in parts of Europe until the late 18th century. The last documented execution by wheel in Germany occurred in 1841, though the practice had largely ended decades earlier. The method's extreme cruelty made it reserved for the worst crimes, including murder, treason, and armed robbery. The death of Simon of Trent. In 1475, a child named Simon of Trent disappeared in the Italian city of Trento. His body was found in a canal days later, and the Jewish community was immediately accused of ritual murder, sparking one of the most infamous blood libel cases in European history. While modern historians recognize the charges were fabricated and the subsequent confessions extracted through torture were false, the tortures and executions that followed were very real and documented in judicial records. Members of the Jewish community were arrested and subjected to torture to extract confessions. The torture method of choice was the strappado. Victims' hands were tied behind their backs, and then they were hoisted by the wrists, their shoulders dislocating as their full body weight hung from arms wrenched behind them. Weights were added to their feet, increasing the strain. They were repeatedly dropped and caught short, the sudden stop causing additional injuries. Under this torture, several Jews confessed to the murder of Simon, describing an elaborate ritual that historians now know was entirely fabricated, matching Christian anti-Semitic myths rather than any actual Jewish practice. The confessions were accepted as truth, and executions were ordered. The condemned were burned alive. Records describe them being tied to stakes and burned on March 21, 1475. But the execution was designed to prolong suffering. The fires were built to burn slowly, with green wood that smoked heavily rather than burning hot. The victims suffocated from smoke before the flames killed them, but the process took longer than a fast-burning fire. As they choked and burned, priests stood nearby, demanding they convert to Christianity and confess their sins. Some did, hoping for mercy that never came. The remaining members of the Jewish community were expelled from Trento. The child Simon was made a saint, and his cult spread across Europe, reinforcing anti-Semitic blood libel myths that would lead to centuries of persecution and violence against Jewish communities. The martyrdom of Simon was used to justify pogroms, expulsions, and murders across Europe for the next 400 years. It wasn't until 1965 that the Catholic Church finally removed Simon from the calendar of saints and acknowledged that the charges were false, the confessions coerced, and the executions unjust. The torture and execution of the Trent Jews stands as an example of how legal systems could be weaponized against minority communities. False confessions extracted through torture, and judicial murder carried out under the guise of justice. The death of Mary, Queen of Scots. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots was executed at Fotheringhay Castle on orders from Queen Elizabeth Thatsty. The execution was meant to be swift and dignified. a single blow from an executioner's axe, severing the head cleanly. Instead, it became one of the most botched executions in English history. Mary was led to the Great Hall, which had been prepared as an execution chamber with a raised platform and a block. She forgave the executioners and placed her head on the block calmly. The executioner raised his axe and struck, but the first blow missed the neck entirely, striking the back of her head and cutting into her skull without killing her. Mary's lips moved, possibly in prayer or possibly crying out, though accounts differ. The executioner struck again. This second blow severed the neck almost completely, but not quite. A portion of sinew and tissue still connected the head to the body. The executioner was forced to use the axe like a saw, cutting through the remaining tissue to fully separate the head. 3 blows total to accomplish what should have taken 1. But the horror didn't end there. When the executioner lifted the head to show the crowd, displaying it with the traditional words, "God save the Queen," the head fell from his hand. He had grasped Mary's wig, which came away in his hand, leaving him holding an auburn wig, while Mary's real head, with its short grey hair, fell to the platform and rolled. There was one final grotesque detail. Mary's small dog, a Skye Terrier, had been hidden in her skirts and was not discovered until after the execution. The dog emerged from beneath the discarded clothing and took up position between the severed head and the body, lying in the pooling blood, refusing to be moved. Servants finally coaxed the dog away, though it was reportedly covered in its mistress's blood and had to be washed. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was meant to be a dignified end to decades of political intrigue and conflict between 2 queens. Instead, the incompetent executioner turned it into a spectacle of suffering, his failure to kill cleanly, with the first blow meaning Mary experienced several blows to the head and neck before finally dying. The incident was seen as a bad omen, and the executioner faced significant public criticism for his failure. The gibbet cage. After execution, some criminals faced a punishment that extended beyond death, gibbeting. The body was placed in an iron cage and hung from a tall post in a public location, left to rot as a warning to others. But in some cases, the condemned were placed in the gibbet cage while still alive, left to die slowly from exposure and dehydration while suspended in the air. The gibbet cage was constructed to fit the body closely, an iron frame roughly human-shaped. When used on living prisoners, the victim would be forced into the cage, which was then locked and hoisted on a tall pole, often at a crossroads or near the site of their crime. Suspended 15 to 20 feet in the air, they were left to die. The first threat was thirst. Deprived of water, the victim would survive perhaps 3 to 5 days, depending on weather conditions. Hot sun would accelerate dehydration, the metal cage heating in the sun and cooking the victim like an oven. Their tongue would swell, throat would close, and eventually their organs would begin to fail. But before death from dehydration, exposure took its toll. During the day, the sun beat down on the metal cage and the exposed victim. At night, temperatures dropped and they had no protection from cold or rain. The weather could be as much a torture as the cage itself. Birds were another threat. Crows and ravens, attracted to the helpless victim, would land on the cage and peck through the bars. They targeted the eyes first, the soft tissue easy to reach. The victim, still alive, would feel their eyes being pecked out, unable to defend themselves or drive the birds away. Then the birds would go for the lips, nose and ears, any exposed soft tissue. Death typically came after 3 to 5 days from a combination of dehydration, exposure, and shock. But the body remained in the cage for months or years afterward, slowly decomposing. The gibbet became a landmark, the skeleton visible inside the cage, a warning to anyone passing by. Some major crossroads had multiple gibbets, creating forests of caged corpses. Historical records document the use of live gibbeting in England until the practice was banned in 1834. The last man gibbeted alive in England was James Cook, a bookbinder who murdered a man in 1832. He was hanged first, then placed in a cage and gibbeted. The reforms had ended the practice of gibbeting living prisoners by that time. But for centuries before, The gibbet cage served as both execution method and post-mortem punishment. The victim's suffering extended beyond death as their body rotted publicly. The death of Jane McCrae. On July 27, 1777, during the American Revolutionary War, Jane McCrae, a young woman from New York, was murdered by Native American warriors allied with the British Army. Her death became one of the most infamous atrocities of the war, used by American propagandists to rally support, though the details were often exaggerated. However, the core facts, documented in military records and eyewitness accounts, reveal a brutal death. McCrae was travelling to meet her fiancé, a loyalist officer with the British forces. She was under the escort of Native American scouts working for the British. For reasons still debated by historians, possibly a dispute over who would receive payment for escorting her, the warriors turned on her. According to accounts from the time, she was tomahawked and scalped. The tomahawk blow or blows struck her head, splitting her skull. Scalping, while the victim was still alive or freshly dead, involved making a circular cut around the crown of the head, then gripping the hair and pulling sharply. The entire scalp, from the hairline to the crown, would tear away with a distinctive sound. If done while the victim was alive, the pain would be extraordinary, the scalp being rich with nerve endings. Her body was found with multiple wounds, suggesting she had struggled or attempted to flee. The most politically significant aspect was her scalp, which was reportedly brought to the British camp and displayed, creating a scandal. The British commander, General Burgoyne, was horrified and demanded the perpetrators be punished, but his Native American allies threatened to abandon him if he pursued the matter. He was forced to let the murder go unpunished. American propaganda made Jane McCrae a symbol of British brutality, using her death to paint the British and their native allies as savages who murdered innocent women. The reality was more complex, involving conflicts between native warriors and a tragic killing that neither side could adequately explain or justify. But her death was real, brutal, and became one of the war's most emotionally charged incidents. Her body was initially buried near where she was killed, but was later exhumed and reburied multiple times. The final exhumation in 2003 allowed forensic examination of her remains, which confirmed she had died from at least one severe blow to the head, consistent with a tomahawk strike. The forensic evidence supported the historical accounts of her violent death. The plague pits of Ayam. In 1665, bubonic plague arrived in the English village of Ayam via infected cloth from London. The village rector, William Mompesson, convinced the villagers to quarantine themselves, sacrificing their own lives to prevent the plague from spreading to surrounding areas. Of the village's 350 residents, 260 died over the next 14 months. While not a single death, but a mass dying, the gruesome nature of plague death deserves documentation. Bubonic plague causes swelling of the lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings, called buboes, grow to the size of apples, painful and filled with pus and blood. The skin over the buboes turns black as tissue dies. Fever spikes to dangerous levels. Victims become delirious, hallucinating and crying out. Many victims died from the buboes themselves, rupturing and releasing infection into the bloodstream, causing septic shock. In Ayam, entire families died within days of each other. The village gravedigger, Marshall Howe, buried his wife and 6 children in 8 days, all dead from plague. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Families dug graves in their own gardens, burying loved ones in the night. The smell of death and decay hung over the village continuously. Some victims developed the pneumonic form, where the plague infected the lungs. They coughed up blood, their lungs filling with fluid. Each breath was agony, drowning in their own bodily fluids. The pneumonic form was even more contagious than the bubonic, spreading through droplets in the air. Those who cared for pneumonic plague victims often contracted it themselves and died within days. The villagers' decision to quarantine meant they died in isolation. No doctors would enter the village. Surrounding villages left food at the boundary stones, refusing to approach closer. The people of Ayam knew they were likely signing their own death warrants when they agreed to the quarantine, but they honoured their commitment. Families watched each other die, knowing they would likely be next, unable to flee or seek help from outside. The mass graves, when excavated by archaeologists in recent years, revealed bodies piled multiple deep, families buried together, the dead showing the characteristic skeletal changes caused by plague. The heroism of Ayam's sacrifice, preventing plague from spreading to the rest of Derbyshire, came at the cost of 260 people dying in agony, their bodies ravaged by disease, isolated and without hope of rescue.